there's a lot of well-educated people who are not successful in their own mind, not my mind, in their mind.
CMS, your social media handle is Born to Deal.
Yes.
What is that about?
Well, I'd say since I was a boy, I was always wheeling and dealing. I recall going back as far as I can remember, when I was a little kid, I used to recycle newspapers, and I'd collect them from the neighbors, and then I'd take them over to the recycling center and get some money for that. I was mowing lawns in high school and junior high school. I would bake stuff because I took money from my lawn mowing, and I bought one of those big Hobart mixers, and I would sell baked goods that I made at home. So I was able to, I didn't really have an allowance. I didn't get much of an allowance as a child. So I took the money that I made from mowing lawns and doing different things, and I kept upping my game. So someone said, gosh, you're born to deal. I don't remember who told me that. You're born to deal, your Gmail should be born to deal. Next thing I know, all my social media handles were born to deal. It was available.
And did you see someone in your family that was entrepreneurial that you emulated, or this was just something as a way to keep time and money coming in?
At the time, I don't really feel like I thought about money so much. I was a different kind of a child. I was I went to someone's house once, and I remember his name was Scott, and his family invited us over, and I was at the house and we're doing barbecue, and I was a guest in the house, and I was a young kid. And I remember the father saying, God, you're kind of rowdy. I had no idea what rowdy was. I had no idea. In fact, I didn't even know a curse word. I learned all that from school. And so I was thinking about this. I finally learned what he was talking about. And I realized that I was just different. I couldn't sit still. I had to be doing something all the time. And being so energetic and having so many things I wanted to be doing, I was tinkering, I was fixing bikes, I had made bikes, I made bicycles. I put used parts and abandoned stuff and made bicycles, and got tired of that bike, I'd make a new one. And I just learned that I needed to be constantly productive. And so it just happened to be that neighborhood people noticed and would pay money for that. And I didn't really think of it as a business at the time. And then as time marched on, it became more entrepreneurial. I lived in Washington, D.C. in my younger years, and at that time, it's most of the people I knew were in the government. They really weren't entrepreneurs or business owners. There was a place called Lake Barcroft where all the wealthy people live, and I was nowhere near that, but I knew all the wealthy kids would talk about their party barges and their being on the lake and all that stuff. I had no idea what that meant, but all of them had some kind of business. They all owned businesses. I knew nothing about it. I didn't even know what an entrepreneur was as a kid.
So being around politics and the defense industry, did you have aspirations to go into politics, or you somehow made your way to LA?
Interesting. So I had a rough childhood, honestly. My father's from India, and you can just fill in the blanks. It's a different culture. I grew up in a Muslim household. That dominated the household. It wasn't. My mother's not a Muslim. She passed away, but my mother was not a Muslim. And my father just operated in that lifestyle. That was the lifestyle we had. It did not align with American children. Other children didn't live like that. So it was rough. And so at 16, there was like this event horizon. You come to that point where you might have accepted the abuse, and then you come to a point where you realize it's abuse and you are aware of it and you become conscious of it. And I just left. So at 16, I left Virginia, and I headed out to LA, and my brother was in LA. He was 25. He was living with an older woman. And that was kind of like he was living with a lady kind of like my father. So it was kind of the repeat. It was like a sequel of what was going on. And we talked about that, and he acknowledged it. And so I left that situation, and then I was kind of homeless for a little while. I lived in a car. I had a car. I got a car for $50. My brother helped me buy it, and then I fixed it up. It wasn't running, and I got it working because I'm very handy. And then I just camped out in the car for a bit, worked a sales job, and then a guy at work said, hey, I've got this room. if you want to rent it, it's $90 a month. I'm like, $90 a month? I was making good money at my sales job. So I said, sure, let's go hang out with you guys. And then wasn't living in a car anymore. That was South Central LA.
In the 80s or 90s? Or?
80, it was 80, by that time it was like 86, I think, it was 86.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
by 1986, yeah.
Now you've had, it sounds like many lifetimes. You've
boy.
almost like maybe 9 lives, like a cat. I don't know, I'm just assuming, I shouldn't.
No, you're good.
Okay.
I like it. It's sometimes things are just obvious. So you have a certain intuition. Anyway, I know that from watching your interviews. And what I would say about this is, young guys without rudders. It's one of the reasons I go out and try to help younger people, specifically younger men, because if they're in the same circumstances I was in, they're going to need some guidance to help them get their compass going. So when you're rudderless and you have nobody there to be a parental figure, you're just operating on sheer will and perseverance and persistence. And I did very well. I mean, I made good money. I was always very financially successful, but it was just, survival. It was just pushing. It wasn't art. It wasn't necessarily filling my cup. It was just work, did the work, get paid, it worked, And so that's how that phase, that little chapter of my life was at that time.
Okay, and at some point you made your way into the U.S. Navy?
Well, that was a long time into the future. So I was in the Navy from 01 to 09, and I worked at the Navy base in Encino, NMCRC Encino Navy base. I was an E5. I was a little overweight, so I got a waiver. They actually give them in the Navy because my rank and rating was IT2, so I was an E5, and just working computers, you don't really have to be that slim. I never got to be on a ship because I feel like I was overweight to be on a ship. I was too big to be on a ship. So you can get a waiver to be in certain job positions, but you're not going to probably be in a ship if you're working in the Navy as an overweight person. So I was a little chubby. And so I got a job working at the Navy base in Encino, and I did that. And that was very fulfilling because I got to serve my country, and I enjoyed doing the work I was doing. But it was very administrative. I say that because the Marines, part of the Navy is the Marines. We are the Navy, and the Navy has a division called the Marines. It's not a separate division. It's not a separate organization. It's part of the Navy. The Marines really do a lot of heavy lifting, like hard, really rough work, and I never had that kind of experience. And I qualify that so that people understand I worked computers.
Well, sure, but then there are, various attacks that come
Sure.
via tech. But during that time, did you continue with your aspirations to want to be in film and television, or that had not entered into your life at that point?
Well, there's a bit of a gap there because if we go rewind back in time, I worked sales jobs, and I was working in marketing and sales in the late 80s and early 90s. And then one day in 1992, which is quite a bit earlier than the Navy, I ran into a guy, and just on the street. I was standing on a street looking at a property that was for sale, and this gentleman came out and he says, "Can I help you? What are you doing over there?" And he didn't say it like that, but he was like, "Can I help you?" He was very nice about it. And I said, "Wait a minute, aren't you on TV?" And it was Dean Butler. He was a television star on Little House on the Prairie. He played in the new Gidget series, and he was in Little House, which is now coming back as another TV series again on Netflix. And we just hit it off, and we had a nice conversation. And at that point, I kind of took a detour into personal management. I was like, "What are you up to?" He's like, "I haven't been up to much. Just been kind of taking a break and whatever." I said, well, why? Why aren't you doing more?" And so we agreed to collaborate, and I asked him, "Well, who's your previous rep and manager?" And we went back to the old management company that he used to be with, and I called them up on the phone and said, "Hey, I'd like to have a meeting." And I went down and met with them, and I met one of the head people there, the lead management executive. And he said, "Well, we're we like you. We think you're an interesting guy. You know, you're kind of, you know, you're a very persistent guy, because of course he called on the phone and it was persistent, and said, we'd be interested in working with Dean, but we'd like to work with Dean if you're involved. I was like, well, okay, that's interesting. So that brought an adventure. You know, I got involved with this organization, Sterling Winters and Kathy Ireland Worldwide. And Kathy and I had beautiful coffee one morning, because it was her company, and with her management executive. And I joined this company as a consultant and did all kinds of things with Kathy Ireland. This is in the 90s and the 2000s. I worked as a consultant doing licensing for brands. Like, you know, you have a product and someone sells that product, they get a license. So Kathy Ireland repped Janet Jackson, Dame Elizabeth Taylor. So I got to work on all these campaigns, and it was a very interesting time. Big adventures, travel, and lots of fun. And Dean got something great out of it. He scored a deal playing Buffy's father on a TV show, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And, you know, I made that happen, which I think was a big feather in my cap as a guy, because I have a big ego sometimes, and I like to score big deals, and that was a big deal to make that happen.
Awesome.
Yeah. So that's, you know, that's kind of a short version of what happened. You know, there's a lot more to that story.
Sure, sure. And there's so many interesting parts to your story from the little research that I did do. One thing I'm curious of is, was there someone that believed in you early on that you were surprised? It could have been a just passing comment that really gave you legs to try new things, to keep going, to persevere?
So everyone needs mentors. You know, I would say that's a very important factor in success in life. And some people will benefit from many mentors, and, you know, having multiple mentors in different areas. And in the 80s, one thing my brother Eric had introduced me to, one of his business associates, who is passed now. He passed. He's not with us anymore. And his name was Michael. And Mike was an antiques dealer, and I got a part-time job as a typist, because in school I learned how to type because it was a good skill to have. And I, for some reason, thought that it would be beneficial because computers were starting to happen. This was in the 70s, you know, and computers were coming, and I saw them coming, so I took typing. And, you know, Mike hired me to be a clerk typist for appraisals, so I did appraisal typing. And he really encouraged me to be a risk taker, try things, not be afraid of, you know, making efforts to stretch myself as a person. And, you know, he mentored me. Another person who never finished high school, Mike was not really good at spelling, so he depended on me to be a speller because he hadn't really had a formal education. Yet he lived in a big, huge mansion, and he had his beautiful house and beautiful collections of art and antiques, and he was quite successful and had a very successful business. And he said, you know, you don't really need to be formally educated, you know, you need to persist. And so over the years, I see these folks that are successful say this over and over again. There's a lot of well-educated people who are not successful in their own mind, not my mind, in their mind. They say, well, I'm not achieving my goals. And, you know, I'm like, well, I don't know. I'm too busy doing it. I don't really know how not to do it. You just do it. It happens. So Mike taught me, just do it, you know, like Nike. And I did. I learned a lot from that experience, and he was one of my many mentors. I was mentored at Kathy Ireland Worldwide. I got a lot of mentorship there for how to be a more gracious, diplomatic person. Because, you know, as a young person, I was very reckless. I was like a bull in a china shop. And I learned sophistication through all the mistakes I made.
Thank you for watching the video all the way to the end. Here is a complimentary question from our book Story Questions.